An investigation into Australia's Anglican church has revealed more than 1,000 claims of child sexual abuse over the past 3.5 decades. And the numbers here are very scary. The interim report that has just been revealed said 1,082 people lodged complaints between 1980 and 2015 that identified 569 members of the Anglican clergy, teachers, and volunteers as alleged abusers. There were an additional 133 alleged abuses reported by people whose roles within the church are not currently known. The average age of the victims was 11, and 75% of them were boys. On average, it took 29 years for each incident to be reported. And that's the sort of pattern that we've seen around the globe when these abuses are eventually unveiled. Let's give you an update on some of the progress with some of these abusers. Of 84 alleged offenders referred to the police, 4 have been prosecuted, while 23 remain under investigation. And in total, all but one of the dioceses in Australia has received at least one complaint. So this is not just a couple of hotbeds of abuse over multiple decades. This is as pervasive as it can be in Australia, and again, matches the pattern that we've seen in other parts of the world. In response to this report, the Archbishop put out this statement: "We are deeply ashamed of the many ways in which we have let down survivors, both in the way we have acted and the way we have failed to act. I wish to express my personal sense of shame and sorrow at the way survivors' voices were often silenced and apparent interests of the church put first." Which again sounds a lot like what leaders of the church have always said when these revelations have come out. They have fought it as long as they can, and then finally the truth is revealed, and then there's a lot of sorrow to go around.
So if that doesn't tell you that religion is empty, then nothing else will, because all the religions act exactly the same when this shit happens. And they all try to squelch the. So what is all that book, all that Bible reading, all that Jesus thinking? When it comes to it, the institution that claims to believe that shit is fucking evil.
Yeah.
Evil in a way you could never imagine. So fuck religion. And think spirituality is personal. And I know there's a lot of people who disagree with me and think religion does a lot of good things. You don't need religion to do good things. People are going to be good with or without religion, and they're going to be bad with or without religion. And people who are drawn to power, which is what religious institutions are, people who are drawn to that power are mediocre people, and often people with nefarious means. Anybody who wants to be around kids like that and says you keep an extra eye on them, especially people who wear their freaking piety on their sleeve.
Yeah, because it kind of seems like, if you didn't have the church, you'd still have people who want to abuse children, but you wouldn't have one of the most powerful organizations in the history of the world defending those people, hiding their crimes.
Right.
They would be on their own, easier to track down and less able to abuse so many people.
I just wonder which people are still allowing their kids to be in this system of being left with these random folks. And I don't care which folks it is, I don't care which religion or breakdown of religion or which church and which country. It's all pretty much across the board, right? So which one of these folks are still allowing their kids to be around? And I'm not saying it's probably stretched further than just the altar boys and things like that, right? So we had a fight and a legal battle and legislation written up about gender neutral bathrooms in North Carolina, and how much these damn transgenders keep coming in and they want to rape your daughters and your wives and your girlfriends because there's so much proof behind it, right? But they'll believe it because you said it enough times.
They believe it.
There's decades of proof behind this, and when you didn't believe it the first time, finally the churches have to come out and admit it. Have you started believing it yet? There's actual proof. So we're worried about, I'm trying not to curse today.
Yeah.
We're worried about restrooms, but we're not worried about this true epidemic of raping kids by a power structure that's made to do just that. Yeah. No one's when are we gonna start believing it? We'll believe it because Pat McCrory said so.
Yeah.
And because there's a perverse thing with these transgender people who are just trying to live.
A lot of people will defend the church. Like so I was brought up Catholic, 12 years Catholic school, and a lot of Catholic people I know, when they defend the church, will say, the incidence of abuse isn't any higher than in the rest of the population. And I'll say 2 things to that. A, well, fantastic. So all your religion doesn't do a goddamn thing for you. It makes you just as fucked up as everyone else. Number 2, it's not the abuse itself. It's that the church then covers up for it. The people who are supposed to be the holiest people and caring about their flock, let the people who are the most vulnerable be abused in the worst way possible and then re-abuse those people. That's the problem with the church. It's not about the incidents or the number of incidences. It's how the church handles it and how they do it. They re-victimize them. They use all their power not to help people, but to screw people over on purpose. The people who we look to are supposed to be holy. Again, someone wears their piety, their religion on their sleeve, automatically be suspect of that person because they are full of it.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, if you're one of the higher ups and one of your priests abuses someone, you can't necessarily stop that from happening the first time. But the second you take that person and say, I will just move them to a different area, every other act of abuse is on you at that point. And they were willing to let it just go from place to place, dozens, hundreds of, these aren't, it's 569 people over 1,000 incidents. We've seen cases in the US where it was dozens against an individual member and lawsuit after lawsuit being settled. That's the problem, as Jimmy pointed out. Now, I want to give you a little bit more information about this investigation. In November, Greg Thompson, the Anglican Bishop of Newcastle, told the Royal Commission that conducted the inquiry that people of power provided protection during decades of abuse by clergy and lay people in the diocese. He also said he felt there were consequences if he did not follow what some within the diocese wanted him to do. He eventually ended up resigning from his position because he felt targeted because he was taking a more serious approach to trying to uncover and have actual consequences for the abuse. Now, that's the Anglican Church. Additionally, last month, it was told the Australian Catholic Church paid $212 million in compensation to thousands of victims since 1980. They had an investigation and found more than 4,400 people who claimed to have been abused by Australian Catholic Church figures during that same 35-year period.
Wow, there's only 10,000 people who live in Australia. Am I wrong about that? I'm pretty sure you can.
Close. It's close. And look, if you haven't watched Spotlight yet, you got to watch Spotlight. Both because it shows you what real investigative journalism can accomplish, but then also how it can go, how they protect them, how they settle the court cases, how they shuffle the priests around, why it is that some people feel so much pressure not to reveal what's happened to them. They go into all of that in Spotlight, and so you should definitely watch it if you want to know more about the situation. And also how widespread it is, that it's not just in Australia and in Boston. At the end of Spotlight, they show where some of the largest scandals have been, and it's dozens and dozens of American and international cities. And it'll just break your heart to see the list there. My hometown, actually, Bridgeport, Connecticut, is on that list.
Are you sick of the mainstream media? Then I got good news for you. We're going to hire some investigative reporters and we're going to go house. We're actually going to investigate what's happening in this country and stand up for you guys. Help us do it. Go to tytnetwork.com/go. If everybody watching this video just gives a little bit of money, we'd have plenty to hire those investigative teams and unleash them on the country.